Hey there, folks! I'm Alex from Last Climb, and today I'll examine the K2 climb that start with a celebration video and ended up having the most terrifying outcome. A single video drove an ego that silenced every help and warning on the way up. And what ended up taking place on that expedition was so devastating, you will never believe someone could make that choice at 26,000 feet. It was June 24th, 2017, and two base camp sat on the rubble-strewn surface of the Baltoro Glacier at roughly 16,400 feet. The camp was nothing like Everest, no tea houses, nothing like Everest's constant helicopter traffic, no cell service. Just tents on shifting moraine, surrounded by some of the most violent geography on Earth. The Karakoram Peak stacking up in every direction, Broad Peak visible to the south, the Gasherbrooms beyond it, and K2 itself rising above everything like something that wasn't designed for people to touch. The mountain's southwest face caught the afternoon light in a way that made it look almost peaceful from below, which was a lie, and everyone at base camp knew it. K2 still had one of the highest fatality rates of any 8,000er, especially compared to Everest, and everybody at base camp knew the margin for error up there was almost non-existent. The Abruzzi Spur, the standard route from the Pakistan side, rose from base camp in a series of increasingly technical and exposed sections that filtered out climbers by attrition and fear long before the real danger began. Among the climbers staged at base camp was Vasco Noronha, 26, from Lisbon, Portugal. Vasco was basically a fitness and adventure content creator, the kind of guy who had built a following of like 40,000 people by filming himself doing increasingly extreme stuff and posting it with captions about pushing limits and trusting the process. Trail running, open water swimming, budget adventure travel across Europe and North Africa. The audience grew when he started climbing. Kilimanjaro got him 5,000 new followers in a week. Elbrus doubled his engagement. A guided ascent of Broad Peak the previous summer, where he turned back at Camp 3 due to weather, convinced him he belonged in the high-altitude world despite never having climbed terrain anywhere near as technical and unforgiving as K2. He talked about that Broad Peak attempt on his channel like it was a moral victory, proof that he could hang with the real climbers, and his audience ate it up, because they didn't know the difference between turning back at Camp 3 on Broad Peak and actually summiting anything in the death zone. K2 was not the logical next step. It was basically the content play that would separate him from every other adventure influencer filming the same three mountains. Everest was kinda oversaturated at that point. Everyone and their mother had Everest content. K2 was different, K2 was savage, K2 was the mountain that scared actual mountaineers, and nobody in the Portuguese fitness space had footage from it. He paid roughly $45,000 to join a small multinational expedition on the Abruzzi Spur, with limited fixed support and shared rope-fixing responsibilities between teams, funded partly by a Portuguese outdoor brand sponsorship built around the expectation of summit content. The footage wasn't technically required, but the entire deal was structured around it, and Vasco understood that coming home without it meant the sponsorship probably wouldn't continue. And honestly, that detail right there is what I keep coming back to, because it means the camera wasn't just a habit for this guy, it was tied to his income. And on K2, that distinction ends up mattering more than anything else in this story. His primarily assigned HAP for the summit push was Ghulam Sadiq, 33, from Hoosh Valley in Baltistan. 3K, 2 summits, quiet, efficient, the kind of HAP that expedition leaders assigned to clients who needed watching. Not because he was patient with egos, but because he had a specific talent for reading when a client was about to make a decision that would get them killed. And so far, he'd been right every time. He'd turned clients around on Broad Peak, pulled one off G2 during a weather shift, and built a reputation that meant expedition leaders trusted his judgment sometimes more than they trusted their own. He had a wife and young son in Hoosh. K2 income funded his son's schooling in Skardu, 2 more seasons and tuition was covered. Ghulam's concern about Vasco started early. During the approach trek along the Baltoro, the 10-day walk from Oscole to base camps through some of the most remote terrain on Earth, he noticed that Vasco treated every rest stop as a filming opportunity. Every meal, every glacier crossing, every view of the mountain from a different angle became content. He filmed other climbers without asking. He filmed porters carrying loads and narrated over the footage as if he were hosting a documentary. It wasn't that filming was unusual on expeditions. Plenty of clients documented their climbs. but Vasco's whole relationship with the camera just felt different, like the experience wasn't real to him until it was recorded. Gula mentioned this to the expedition leader during the first week at base camp. The leader noted it and moved on. Acclimatization rotations began in early July after about a week of rest and preparation at base camp, cycling through camps 1, 2, and 3 on the Abruzzi Spur. The route climbed through increasingly hostile terrain, from the scree and snow slopes below Camp 1 to the steeper mixed climbing of the Black Pyramid between Camps 2 and 3, where fixed ropes threaded through rock chimneys and across ice-glazed ledges that required constant attention. Vasco performed adequately through all of it. Not elite, not struggling, middle of the pack among the commercial clients. His fitness carried him through the lower sections where cardiovascular capacity mattered most. Gym fitness and mountain fitness are two completely different things though, and the higher they went, the more obvious that gap was going to become. The technical terrain above Camp 2 exposed his limited mountaineering experience, but not dangerously so. The first real warning sign came during a rotation to Camp 2 at roughly 21,300 feet, on a section of exposed traverse where the route crossed a steep snow slope with a 1,000-foot drop below. Vasco stopped to film a time-lapse of cloud movement in the valley. Ghulam waited. Other climbers passed them. The time-lapse took 4 minutes. 4 minutes just standing there on a slope where you're supposed to keep moving, because rockfall from above pretty much funnels through that exact section every afternoon when the sun loosens debris. 4 minutes on an active rockfall slope for a time-lapse that would get maybe 3,000 views. That's the moment I knew where this story was going. The second warning came at Camp 3 around 24,600 feet. Vasco's oxygen consumption ran higher than expected because he kept removing his mask briefly to talk to camera, each time just 10 or 15 seconds. But those seconds kinda accumulated across hours of climbing, and the math showed up in his bottle pressure. Each removal caused his blood oxygen to drop pretty sharply, and afterward, he'd have to crank the regulator flow higher to recover, which basically drained the supply way faster than planned. Over a full day of climbing, those interruptions compounded in ways that showed clearly on the gauge. Ghulam noted this to the expedition leader, who spoke with Vasco directly. Vasco agreed to limit filming above Camp 3, but basically never followed through on that, which didn't surprise Ghulam at all. The summit window opened in the last week of July. Forecasts predicted 36 to 48 hours of manageable wind on the upper mountain, and multiple teams began moving upward simultaneously. They reached Camp 4 at roughly 25,000 feet on the shoulder, a broad exposed snow platform where wind hit from every direction, and the only thing between you and the sky was the summit pyramid above. Tents flapped violently even in moderate gusts. The cold at Camp 4 was a different species of cold than anything below. Sharper, more insistent. The kind that found you through 4 layers and punished any exposed surface within seconds. Vasco arrived tired, but functional. The summit push was planned for a midnight departure. I want to be clear about something before we get into summit day. Vasco wasn't incompetent. He was fit, he was motivated, and he had made it to Camp 4 on K2, which is further than most people will ever go. The problem wasn't ability, it was priority. His priority was footage, and on K2, that's the wrong priority to have. They departed Camp 4 around midnight on July 27th. Temperatures sat around -30 Fahrenheit before wind chill, the kind of cold that turned exposed skin white in minutes and made every metallic surface a contact hazard. The stars were visible for the first time in days. The Milky Way spilling across a sky so clear it looked artificial. Headlamps traced a line up the shoulder toward the bottleneck, a slow procession of light moving upward through darkness. Each lamp representing a person who had paid and trained and suffered to be in one of the most dangerous places on Earth at 2 in the morning. Every K2 climber knows the bottleneck rule. The bottleneck is a steep couloir at roughly 26,000 to 27,000 feet, where a massive serac field, hundreds of feet tall and thousands of tons heavy, hangs directly above the climbing route. You move through as fast as possible. You never stop. The seracs above can calve without any warning at all, and when they do, they send thousands of tons of ice down the exact path climbers are standing on, and there is literally nowhere to go if you're in the way. The 2008 K2 disaster killed 11 people in that section, Everybody on the mountain in 2017 knew the history. Vasco filmed the approach to the bottleneck. Ghulam told him to put the camera away through this section. Vasco put it in his chest pocket, but pulled it out twice during the traverse for quick handheld shots, both times under 10 seconds. Both times noticed by Ghulam, who said nothing, because saying something in the bottleneck meant stopping in the bottleneck, which was worse than 10 seconds of footage. They cleared the bottleneck and the traverse above it by early morning, before the sun hit the Sirax. This was correct timing. The schedule held, barely. Above the traverse, the route steepened toward the summit snowfield. Climbing was slow, exhausting. Every single step cost effort that the altitude made completely out of proportion to the distance gained, kinda like walking through knee-deep sand while breathing through a straw. Cloud built during the morning. Visibility dropped to roughly 100 to 150 feet. Not a whiteout, but enough to obscure the summit pyramid above. At approximately 28,050 feet, Vasco reached a rounded snow dome on the upper summit snowfield. In reduced visibility, with no reference points above, it looked and felt like the top. The ground sloped away in every direction he could see. He broke down. Emotional, elated, completely overwhelmed, he basically dropped to his knees in the snow and pulled his camera out and recorded like 2 minutes of fragmented celebration footage. Tears running down his face, mask pulled aside, thanking his followers between gasps, thanking his family, saying he did it. His voice broke multiple times and he had to pause to breathe between sentences, the altitude stripping his ability to speak in anything longer than short bursts. He turned the camera to show the panorama around him, cloud in every direction, the world falling away below. He transmitted a compressed still frame and a short text update through the expedition satellite device with a caption claiming the summit of K2. The image uploaded intermittently over the next hour through the SAT terminal back at Camp 4, and by the time it reached his followers, the comments were already building. Ghulam arrived at Vasco's position and immediately knew this was not the summit. When the cloud thinned briefly, the actual summit pyramid was still visible roughly 200 vertical feet above them. He told Vasco. Vasco did not accept it. He checked his altimeter, which at that altitude had significant margin of error due to pressure fluctuations. He looked around, turning in every direction, trying to find something higher. He argued with Ghulam, insisting the cloud was hiding nothing. Ghulam waited, then pointed upward as the cloud briefly thinned, and for a few seconds, the actual summit pyramid was unmistakably visible above them, a dark triangular shape still 200 vertical feet away. Vasco stared at it and said nothing for a long time. Then the realization hit. He had posted a summit claim that was wrong, and it was already out there. His sponsor had seen it. His followers had seen it. People were basically already congratulating him on a photo taken 200 feet below the actual summit of K2. Vasco decided to continue to the real summit. Ghulam objected. They were already behind the timeline. The celebration had burned more than 20 minutes of energy and oxygen they did not have to spare, and the weather window was narrowing, with cloud building from the west. Vasco insisted. Going home with a false summit claim posted to his entire following was not something he was willing to do. The correction would live on the internet forever. Every comment congratulating him would become evidence of his failure. In his mind, the only fix was the real summit. The ego math happening in his head at that altitude is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. He could have radioed base camp, corrected the post, taken the embarrassment, and descended alive. Instead, he chose the summit because the video was already out there, and admitting it was wrong felt worse than continuing into conditions his guide was telling him would kill him. Ghulam's options were to follow his client upward or abandon him alone above 27,000 feet. He followed. They pushed upward through deteriorating visibility. Vasco's pace had dropped noticeably, his oxygen consumption unsustainable, the false peak celebration having cost him reserves he could not get back. Each step was slower than the last, the altitude extracting more energy than his depleted body could generate. Ghulam stayed close, monitoring, calculating the timeline that was already broken. They reached the actual summit at around 11:40 a.m., which on K2 is pretty much dangerously late since most summit times aim for before 10 a.m. to give you enough time to get back down through the bottleneck before the midday sun starts loosening the Sirax above. Vasco knew this was his only chance to get clean summit footage, the footage his sponsor required, the footage that would correct the false peak image already circulating online, the footage that would make everything he had done over the past month mean something to the people watching. He unclipped from the fixed line, He pulled his oxygen mask down below his chin so his face was visible. He extended his arm and started filming himself on the summit of K2, face to camera, goggles pushed up, mask hanging around his neck, the Karakoram stretching out behind him in every direction. He unclipped from the fixed line on the summit of K2 and took his mask off for a video. I need you to understand what that means. K2 is not Everest. The summit ridge is narrower, more exposed, and the wind at that altitude can go from manageable to deadly between breaths. Unclipped with no mask means one gust away from gone. A wind gust caught him mid-sentence. He staggered sideways toward the edge, his body off balance from the extended arm holding the camera. His left glove, already loosened so he could operate the camera with his bare fingers, came off his hand and disappeared over the edge into the void. Bare skin at -30 with wind chill, which is basically instant damage. The hand immediately began to burn with a cold that felt like the opposite of fire. Ghulam grabbed him and got him back on the line, got his mask back on, wrapped his exposed hand in a spare buff, but the skin had already whitened almost immediately, and once frostbite takes hold at those temperatures, it doesn't stop progressing until you get to a hospital. Total time on the actual summit was roughly 8 minutes, most of it spent filming. They began descent at approximately 11:48 a.m. Nearly 2 hours behind the safe schedule, the descent was slow from the start. Vasco was running on nothing, depleted from the false peak, the extra 200 feet of climbing, the unclip incident, his frostbitten hand losing function inside the wrapped buff, the fingers swelling and turning the color of old wax. His oxygen supply was critical, each breath draining a bottle that was already lower than it should have been at this point on the descent. Every step required concentration he was kinda running out of, and the altitude was just taking pieces of his coordination with each passing hour. They reached the traverse above the bottleneck in early afternoon. The sun had been hitting the Seracs for hours by this point. The ice above was groaning, audible even through wind and oxygen masks. Deep structural sounds that came from somewhere inside the ice mass and meant the frozen weight above was expanding and shifting as solar radiation warmed surfaces that were never meant to see this much heat. Small debris had already fallen across sections of the route below, chunks of ice the size of refrigerators just scattered across the couloir where climbers had been walking hours earlier. Other climbers ahead of them were moving through the danger zone quickly, exactly the way you're supposed to. Ghulam set the pace into the bottleneck, fast, controlled, no stopping for any reason. The couloir funneled them downward beneath the Serac wall, every second spent in its shadow. Another second the odds worked against them. Other teams moved with visible urgency, clipping past anchors with practiced speed. Nobody looking up because looking up didn't help. The route was just littered with fresh debris, ice chunks from earlier calving events scattered across the path, like warnings nobody needed translated. You could pretty much see exactly what the Seracs were capable of just by looking at the ground you were walking on. At approximately 26,500 feet, midway through the bottleneck, directly beneath the largest section of the Serac field, Vasco stopped. He pulled his camera out. He wanted to film the descent through the bottleneck, the Seracs visible above, the scale of where they were, the exposure. This was the shot, the one that would basically make the entire video, the massive wall of ice hanging over them while he narrated the descent, the kind of footage that gets millions of views because it looks insane and it is insane. Ghulam physically grabbed his arm and pulled. Vasco resisted. He said he needed 30 seconds. Ghulam told him they needed to move now, that the Seracs had been shedding debris all afternoon, and standing still in the bottleneck at 2 in the afternoon was basically not even a risk anymore. It was a guarantee. Vasco pulled his arm free and framed the shot, panning upward toward the Serac wall above them. 30 seconds. He just needed 30 seconds. I've covered a lot of last decisions on this channel, the kind people make at altitude when their judgment is gone. But this one is different because Vasco was almost certainly hypoxic, but not so impaired that he didn't understand the risk. He made a conscious choice to stand underneath a wall of unstable ice for content. And I genuinely don't know what to do with that. The sound came first, a deep crack that resonated through the couloir like a gunshot amplified by the ice walls. Then a roar that built faster than the brain could process it. Ice calved from the Serac band above the bottleneck. Not the entire face, that would have killed everyone on the route, but more than enough to destroy anything in its path. A massive slab of ice broke loose and triggered a cascade of debris straight down the couloir, accelerating as it fell, picking up more ice and snow as it went. directly over the section of route where Vasco was standing, with a camera pointed at the sky. Ghulam was roughly 15 feet ahead and below, partially sheltered by a rock rib on the edge of the couloir that provided just enough cover to deflect the main debris stream. The debris field hit the center of the bottleneck where Vasco was standing. The blast of ice and snow ripped him off his feet and sent him tumbling down the couloir. One surviving anchor finally arrested what was left of his fall after the sections above it had ripped free, leaving him partially buried in debris roughly 100 feet below where he had been standing. The camera was ripped from his hand and disappeared. Ghulam reached him within minutes. Vasco was conscious but pretty much catastrophically injured. Multiple fractures visible through his suit, his breathing wet, shallow, and uneven in a way that basically screamed chest trauma and internal bleeding. At 26,500 feet, with injuries like that, there is no rescue. There is no stretcher carry down a 60-degree couloir. Radio calls went down to Camp 4 almost immediately, but everyone on both ends understood the same reality. The math doesn't exist. He lost consciousness within 30 minutes. Ghulam stayed beside him the entire time, adjusting his mask, shielding his body from wind, talking to him, even after the responses stopped, doing the small things that don't change the outcome, but mean someone was there when it mattered. Other climbers passed on the fixed line. Some paused briefly, a few offered whatever they could carry, but at that altitude and in that location, nobody could stop for long without risking the same fate. Vasco stopped breathing shortly after. Ghulam stayed with him until he was certain, then descended through the lower bottleneck alone as the afternoon light turned the seracs above, golden and unstable. He moved quickly, the way K2 demanded, not looking up, not looking back. Ghulam did everything right. He warned Vasco at every single point where a warning could have mattered. On the approach, in the bottleneck, at the false peak, at the summit, on the descent. Every time he was overruled by a 26-year-old with a camera and a contract. That's the part of this that stays with me the most. Vasco Noronha died in the bottleneck of K2 on July 27, 2017. He was 26 years old. The part that I keep getting stuck on is that he actually made it. He stood on the real summit of K2. He achieved the thing he came to achieve, and then he gave it all back, 30 seconds at a time, in a place where 30 seconds is the difference between walking home and not walking at all. His satellite-posted false summit image accumulated thousands of likes and comments before his expedition confirmed his death 2 days later. People were literally still posting congratulations under a photo taken on the wrong spot by a man who was already dead. Fragments of the camera and its storage card were recovered lower on the route by a team clearing debris weeks later. The last recoverable footage was a shaky panning shot of the seracs above the bottleneck, the frame blurring, then nothing. Ghulam Sadiq sustained a fractured wrist and deep bruising from ice debris that caught the edge of his position behind the rock rib. The wrist healed improperly over the following months, the bone setting at an angle that limited his grip strength permanently and ended his ability to do the technical lead work that high-altitude guiding required. He could still carry loads at lower altitudes, but the earning potential that came with summit-level HAP work was gone. It wasn't a dramatic injury, it was the kind that just quietly takes your livelihood away while everyone else moves on. 3 summits, years of work, and his career ended because a client needed 30 seconds of footage in the one place on K2 where 30 seconds can kill you. He returned to Hoosh Valley and took work unrelated to expeditions. His son started school in Skardu that September on savings from seasons Ghulam would never repeat. The boy was 7 years old. The expedition company reviewed its protocols regarding client filming in hazard zones. No formal changes were made. The Portuguese brand that had sponsored Vasco's climb quietly removed his content from their channels within a week of the announcement and never publicly acknowledged the sponsorship again.